change have relatively unequivalent science. What we don't have is enough humans convinced that they can do something about it or care enough to do something about it. How do we achieve meaningful conservation and engage the general public? So this talk summarizes the new era of conservation and presents some examples from Cliff's 30-year career of working with biologists, scientists, public schools, city planners, elected officials, government agencies, and nonprofits that can help conserve birds and other wildlife while engaging people from all walks of life in learning about and participating in nature and ultimately conservation. And with that, I'll hand it over to Cliff.
Okay. So, can you put the phone on so people can see the audience?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out why I'm not.
You need to share, you need to be able to share the screen, right? Okay. Yeah, well, we'll have to unmic him. Turn off your mic. And go ahead and turn on your video.
No, I don't want the video.
You don't want to see? You don't want to be seen?
No, I want the whole screen to be the.
Turn off your volume. Turn off your volume. You got an echo, so turn off your volume. There you go. Thank you.
All right.
Good.
We should be all set. Can you all hear me?
This says not hearing anything.
Not hearing anything. My mic is on. I don't need to turn on my volume because then it'll come out my speaker.
Can you turn the volume off of your speaker?
It is.
Okay.
That's.
Okay, that's good.
So I'm wondering if it's the same issue with the phone.
I don't think so.
Is there any way to say we're having a technical problem?
I think they know we are. If we start, I'm afraid if we mess with that, it's gonna.
I need to talk through that microphone.
We can try that. I'm afraid we're gonna get a loop. Your mic is on.
No, it's not.
You're sounding clear out in Zoom land, at least for me.
Your mic is on. It's picking something up, but where's it going?
But it's not right. That's what I meant. It's not transferring to everyone else hearing it.
Dan, can you hear us?
You're loud and clear, and I'm seeing Cliff's desktop. It's all good.
That's because the audio is off of that screen.
Say that again. Can you say that again, Dan? You can hear us, right?
You are, yeah, you're loud and clear, and I'm seeing Cliff's desktop.
On the phone?
He can hear me. He's talking. So just if you can't hear us, just go ahead and chat us to let us know where we're at, and then otherwise we're going to proceed on. Can you make your screen full screen?
I did that.
Okay, you're on foot.
No, I can't when it's sharing. No, once it shares screen.
Turn this volume off. Turn it back on. You can't have speakers on. Okay, thanks. Go ahead and speak.
All right, we'll just go.
If we can't hear you, I'm gonna see a chat, right, Dan? Let's go.
All right, well, very good.
Yeah, we're good. Go.
Oh, we can't hear him now.
We don't need to hear you, okay? We turn on too many speakers, we're good.
Thank you for your patience, and thank you for the opportunity to share with you this evening. As an introduction, a little bit more about myself. I did my Bachelor's of Science and my Master's degree at Humboldt State, studying wildlife management with an emphasis in waterfowl. And I've spent the last 25 years really working with a variety of species in the Central Valley. Most of our threatened and endangered terrestrial species I've worked with, as well as a whole suite of different bird species. But really, I am a waterfowl biologist as well, and a waterfowl scientist. And I had a great run from 2014 to 2021. I created and led the largest fish and wildlife research program in North America. And we collaborated with biologists in 15 different states, 4 Canadian provinces, Siberia, and Mexico, and then 6 different universities. And it was a great run, and we're up to now. That program was the Sassoon Marsh Waterfowl and Managed Wetland Research Program, and we studied everything from waterfowl to raptors, salt marsh harvest mice, western pond turtles, a whole suite of that system. And it's been a great run. Up to this last month now, we've had 17 peer-reviewed journal articles come out of that program. 72. I'm just thinking the last few years we have 17, a total of 72. So it's been a great run.
Yeah.
Great run. We're still publishing papers off that work and running with it. And in addition to that, I'll talk a little bit about some of the education work I've done. I started working with kids with the Yolo Basin Foundation in 1998 in the Yolo Bypass in their Discover the Flyway program. So I've been doing that a long time as well. And then I also sit on 3 different boards of directors. So I sit on the Sacramento Audubon Board of Directors, and I'm also the conservation chair. So I lead all our conservation activities. And then I sit on the board for the Environmental Council of Sacramento. And then our Habitat 2020 group with ECOS, I am the co-chair. So very involved with a lot of things going on in that area. And then one more board, I sit on the American River Natural History Association board, which oversees the FEA Nature Center, which is about you guys seem familiar with it, yeah. And so I'm very, very involved with a lot of different things going on in the area. And in addition to that, the last 20 years I've spent raising kids. My kids currently are 19, 16, 15, and 13. And my son there in the middle, he's a 19-year-old. My girls are 16, 15, and 13. And my girls, one of the things I've been very involved with is adoption. My girls, we adopted from the foster care system. So for years, I sat on the board of Capital Adoptive Families Alliance, working with families and kids that have been adopted from the foster care system. And my family grew very quickly. We had a 4-year-old and then brought my now 16-year-old daughter home at 6 months of age. 6 months later, brought home her 7-day-old baby sister. Yeah, thought we were done. And 18 months later, got a phone call one afternoon, and the next day brought her 3-month-old sister home. So kids came in short order. And you can see here, one of the blessings in my job is being able to take them out in the field with me and get them doing all kinds of things. And I don't think I'm going to have any biologists out of the group, but I'll tell you, my kids do know their wildlife. I'll share one story. My son there in the middle with that duck in his hands, he was in preschool, so he would have been 4. And one day I went to preschool to pick him up early to go out in the field with me. Actually, we're going to do some Swainson Hawk surveys. And picked him up early. He'd been a total goofball in the class, and the teacher says, "Oh, Jake, you silly goose, your dad's here to pick you up." And Jake looks over at the teacher and he just starts shaking his head and he puts his hands on his hips, shaking his head. Finally looks back up. "Miss Melinda, there is no such species as silly goose. Canada goose, yes. Snow goose, yes. White front, yes. Silly goose, no." So my kids have got a dose of it. They know their birds and know basic wildlife management concepts and stuff, and had a lot of fun with them. And my field crew there banding birds with me and doing counts. So a quick outline of where I want to go with this talk. I want to share with you a few different, I'll call them success stories in what I'm calling this new era of conservation. One with waterfowl and two with fish. And then talk a little about this novel ecosystem concept and climate change. And really kind of get at this question a little bit of what in the world are we teaching kids and the public about climate change? And then get into some of the things I've been doing with environmental education. So as we get into these topics, let me set the stage of the Central Valley of California, where I'm going to be highlighting some of this work. If we look at what that area looked like historically, the Central Valley, it really was a riverine system, right? Our rivers flooded maybe 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a year, creating seasonal wetlands. When the rivers came together, we had big deltas, permanent wetlands, scattered grassland habitats, riparian corridors, big swath of wetlands and tule marshes, but also very, very dynamic. So California's also always had periods of drought and intense rainfall. So, there was years where those rivers didn't overflow, where it was very, very dry, fires, all that kind of good stuff. So a very dynamic system. And one of the things that's fascinating for me is that isn't all that different than what some of the climate change models predict for precipitation. The timing's different, the intensity might be different, but it's a lot of swings like that. Very dry, very wet, very dry, very wet, which, it gives us the opportunity for our suite of species in the state that they're adapted to that change in hydrology. It's different. Like I say, it might be earlier in the year, it might be later, that timing might change, but it gives us an opportunity to work with these species to allow them to persist and to thrive in the face of that. And then what happened? Well, people need habitat too. And we did a real good job of that, building homes, farmland, and, really it's people. In 1950, we had 10 million people in this state. 2024, we've got about 40 million people in this state. So just a lot of impact on the land, and that hydrology has been severely changed, right? Our rivers really don't flood anymore. They're channelized, there's big levees on them. Even our sloughs, our creeks, everything is developed to get water off the landscape as quickly as possible and out of an area. So our adjacent lands don't flood that are either now prime ag land or they're urban communities. So very different.
That's a lot of cinnamon teal.
Yeah. Actually, I'll show you a picture of that pond. That pond actually has the highest density and number of cinnamon teal anywhere in the Pacific Flyway.
I believe it.
Yeah. I got a count this year in October of 737 cinnamon teal on 20 acres. Nobody's ever heard anything like that. Yeah.
Where was that?
City of West Sacramento. Yeah, I'll show you a picture of the pond later. So, in light of those drastic changes we've seen in the environment in California, I want to start by talking about waterfowl. And the wintering waterfowl in the Central Valley, really, Central Valley is one of the most important wintering waterfowl regions in North America. It supports the single largest concentration of waterfowl in the wintertime in North America. Currently, 3 to 4 million waterfowl in the wintertime in the Central Valley. And in some years, more than 60% of the waterfowl in the Pacific Flyway are in the Central Valley. So, And more than 20% of all North American wintering waterfowl some years are in the Central Valley. So very, very important. And I touched on some of our research down here, these two pictures of the snow goose and the blue-winged teal. You can see transmitters on them. And so for 14 different species of waterfowl, we attach transmitters that you can see the shiny thing on the top. That's actually a solar panel that kept the battery charged and then gives a GPS coordinate as frequently as every 30 minutes. And if the bird stayed alive and the radio data chats, we got 2 to 3 years worth of data. And this graphic in the bottom right, that map, each one of those lines is a series of dots. Those are where the birds from Sacramento Valley went after spending the winter. And you can see they're going really all over North America.
And Russia.
Yeah, no, exactly. And in Russia, we actually had, there's a couple pink dots. We've had birds on mainland Siberia, as well as some of the other islands. And then you can see some of this pink stuff in the bottom right. We've had some wild ones where one of the first pintails, we captured a hen pintail near Sacramento Refuge. She spent the first winter in the Central Valley. She bred in Alberta. Next winter, she went to Texas and Louisiana and spent the winter in Texas and Louisiana. Then she bred in Alaska, and then she came back to the Central Valley. Like, whoa. So no, these birds are going everywhere, and they're not following you pick up your Peterson's field guide, and they have these nice little flyway windows. You can see through the middle of the country what ends up happening. These birds do a lot of mixing. The Great Salt Lake is one area where birds mix a lot. And then north there into Saskatchewan and Alberta, there's a couple key locations where birds from the Arctic are coming together there, and there's a lot of mixing. So the take-home message is really the importance of these habitats for a whole suite of birds that are traveling across North America. And one of the things that happened in the 1980s, we saw a crash in our wintering waterfowl populations. And this graph is just pintail, but that shows you what happened pretty nicely. Pintail alone, we went from in the 70s having about 3 million pintail in the Central Valley in the wintertime, down to in the 80s having about 500,000. So huge crash in our waterfowl populations. And that got a lot of people's attention. And really the causes of that decline were a combination of drought, both long-term drought in California, as well as prairie pothole region, North Dakota, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, that region. And then a lot of urban and agricultural expansion and a lot more stress on our water being used by all kinds of people that hadn't been using it before. And so having less water available and less habitat on the ground to, if you will, make up for those drought conditions by having surface water or groundwater. So it brought a lot of people together, and really it started a movement of conservation. The 90s were a start of really extensive wetland habitat creation and enhancement throughout the Central Valley. Our state, this map, these colored blocks are our state wildlife areas or national wildlife refuges. And we targeted those areas and started building habitat around them. We were fortunate we had a lot of funding available. So programs through the federal government, the North American Waterfowl Conservation Act, NRCS's Wetland Reserve Program, and then state and federal duck stamp funding. We had a lot of funds, and we're actually at a point in time in the 90s where we didn't do any environmental regulations either. So we didn't do CEQA, we didn't do endangered species compliance. We just went and built habitat, and everybody celebrated it. It was great. It was fantastic. I mean, we built tens of thousands of acres and just ran with it. And it was also a very unique time. There's a picture in the corner there of Dan Chapin, who was the government affairs lead for California Waterfowl Association. He got passed a law, the Sassoon Marsh Preservation Act, which is the only law in the country that requires the wintering waterfowl populations be maintained in the Sassoon Marsh. So it actually has a target. You have to maintain wintering waterfowl populations there. So a lot of energy around that, a lot of money around that. And we were very successful creating managed wetlands, which If you're not familiar with this concept of managed wetlands, you can see a levee pushed up here, water control structures. I mean, we're building these habitats. We're building it in the Central Valley in places that, were seasonal floodplains that have those wetland soils, can hold water, but building that habitat and then running water to it. And during that period, we created more than 250,000 acres of managed wetlands. So very successful with that. And yes, yes. I actually worked on a couple of the first easements in the Cosumnes River Preserve, which now we're up to 38,000 acres of protected habitat. Yeah, yeah. And we were fortunate. One of the things that happened during that same period is, if you ever spend any time in the Sacramento Valley in particular, during the late 80s, when rice gets harvested, what's left over is this brown stubble. And the rice farmers used to burn all that. And the air quality was just absolutely horrible. And slowly, but surely, early 90s to about 1994, it got legislated out. And they could burn very little of it. And Ducks Unlimited, Audubon, TNC really stepped up and took charge and working with the farmers to demonstrate that flooding that stubble in the wintertime was the most effective way to decompose it. It decomposes, you get birds in there stomping it, that fertilizes the ground. They can lease that out for hunting. If you guys don't know much about waterfowl hunting in the Sacramento Valley, you can lease what I'll call a duck blind, which maybe size of the table there, would sit 3 or 4 people in it in a rice field in the wintertime in the Sacramento Valley. And a rice farmer can make anywhere from $4,000 to $8,000 for each blind.
Wow.
So yeah, so you got the opportunity to make some more income. It's, decomposing and it took off. And so now we're at the point, any given year, we have anywhere from 200,000 to 500,000 acres of winter flooded rice, which is a great surrogate wetland. We've worked with the rice industry now to document its habitat use for a whole suite of shorebirds, giant garter snakes, and I'll get into even some salmon benefits. So we took this area that had lost a ton of habitat and basically within a span of 15 years created almost 1 million acres of wetland habitat if you throw rice in there with it. And then we started at the same time really doing a lot of research and science behind creating and managing these habitats. With that came the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, which then said, flyway wide and continent wide, what are our goals? How do we step them down? And then how do we coordinate across researchers across North America to understand what waterfowl need in the wintertime? And so with these managed wetlands, again, we can control the water. So how deep they are, how long they stay flooded. And, really what we started to do is recognize that we could grow a whole suite of plants that benefit waterfowl. So dry these ponds out, much like, if we go back to that historical component of these floodplain habitats that flooded in the wintertime, then dried during the spring and summer. They grow a whole suite of plants that then when flooded in the wintertime again, provided seed for waterfowl to eat and other birds, decomposed and provided aquatic invertebrates, and did that across a huge area of the landscape. And we could do that in a much, much more productive way. Figure out what are the ideal conditions on each of these ponds to maximize those food rates and maximize that growth for food. And a whole bunch of science throughout the flyways on how to do that. And, what we saw was waterfowl populations rebound tremendously. So by, this graph only goes to 2015, but you see we went, anywhere from 2 to 3 million waterfowl up to over 5 million in some cases. So our populations have recovered, really, really well, despite the fact that we lost all those historic wetlands. Despite that, we're able to maintain these waterfowl populations. And in general now, our waterfowl populations are as high as they've ever been. And so that got us thinking again about this floodplain habitat and this idea where this managed wetlands provide those values for waterfowl. Could we do it for salmon? and these other fish, the other species that need it. And in 2021, a group of us got together, we signed an MOU, a California Trout, Ducks Unlimited, California Rice Commission, and Northern California Waterfowl Association to formalize a relationship to work on salmon recovery in these habitats. And really, when we look at these habitats for salmon, what I'm really talking about, our salmon come upstream. They come from the ocean, different runs. In Central Valley, we have 4 different runs, and they run up the streams, they spawn, and then those eggs hatch their time when historically there'd be flood events. So our juvenile salmon would come out. We've got a fall run, which coordinates with the first rains of the season. We have a winter run with the big storms in the wintertime, and then a spring run that would coordinate with that snow melt and that runoff. And so our young of the year come out with those floods, and then before levees, they would follow that water up over the sides of the levees, and as that water went into the uplands, that floodplain habitat, much like we created for waterfowl, those plants would decompose very quickly, grow a bunch of aquatic invertebrates. They're out of the flow of the stream, and they sit there and eat all those aquatic invertebrates and then come on out. And that's really what they need. And when you look at our streams now, they're channelized. They don't have any interaction with the vegetation around them. There's none of that energy conversion, if you will, where this water is flooding, decomposing vegetation, all that kind of stuff. And so they're food deserts. And so we started looking at, okay, we know they need these floodplains. We can't create floodplains everywhere. We can't pull levees back. We can't take land out of production. Could we grow the food they need and deliver it then into the river? And so we started working with this rice stubble, just like we're doing with waterfowl, flooding that. And in this case, we found that you can flood it shallow, 8 to 10 inches, hold that water for about 3 weeks, grow a bunch of aquatic invertebrates, and then dump it into the Sacramento River when fish are present. And to test that, then we put cages out, caged juvenile salmon in different locations. So right where you put the food in, upstream, downstream, and see if growth rates change, basically. And very successful program. We started with 1,500 acres in 2015. 2023, we had 50,000 acres across the landscape. And these lands, you can flood them more than once too, just like in the natural system. So, you flood that rice initially, get a burst of aquatic invertebrates, dump it into the river, dry it out, flood it again, hold the water for 3 weeks, get more aquatic invertebrates, dump it out. And you do that 2 or 3 times. So you can need multiple food deliveries, if you will.
So what are aquatic invertebrates?
Basically bugs.
Bugs, invertebrates.
Yeah, bugs that live in the water. Yeah, zooplankton and phytoplankton. Yeah, little insects. And what we found was pretty amazing. So this bottom picture kind of shows you this rice field. You see that cloudy water? All those are aquatic invertebrates in there, and how thick that is with bugs. Bug soup, if you will. Compared to a canal, which has very little, and compared to the Sacramento River that has almost nothing in it, just a ton of food. And then you can see how the fish grew. So in this far left one is floodplain fish, so fish that were delivered those food subsidies. And then the river fish are upstream of those subsidies, so they didn't get any of that. And then just comparing it as a control to an adjacent canal that got none of it. And you can see how much bigger and fatter, longer these fish are by getting that subsidy. And one of the fascinating things was we had cages as much as 5 miles downstream from where that input source was, and those fish were still growing that big. So, really being able to feed a lot of fish. And what we found is their survival, not, what you'd hope. Working with UC Davis, they developed a method to be able to track their survival and return rates. And these fish were surviving in the ocean at a much higher rate than their other cohorts and returning at a much bigger rate. So we're able to bring a lot more salmon back. So really, really cool stuff. And another, I'll call it a success story, Poudre Creek. this is more of a resilience story, if you will, but Poudre Creek runs out of Lake Berryessa and goes into the Sacramento River. Monticello Dam was built, finished in the late 50s, and that cut off the creek from any salmon run. That creek had a salmon run up through the lake and up into those reaches, and basically salmon all but disappeared. And many years later, 1990, funding became available to do some major creek improvements, create spawning habitat out there, enhance some areas along Poudre Creek. And then with that, it took 10 years of legal battles to get more water released from the dam at the right times of year. Now, our salmon are cold water fish. They need cold water. One of the things our reservoirs can do is hold cold water at the bottom of the reservoir and then release it when fish need it. And so after years of wrangling about it, they finally got the water set and released at the right times to create. So we created a bunch of spawning habitat. Now we have the cold water for them. We just didn't have any salmon. And by 2013, we had eight salmon return. And then 2014, we had 200. And by 2015, we estimated between 1,500 and 1,700 salmon returned to the creek.
Wow.
Yeah. And then we said, well, where are these fish coming from? And what's fascinating here, most of them were hatchery fish. About 85% of them were hatchery fish, but they also came from other runs. So they came from the Feather River, they came from the Quality River, they came from the Sacramento River. So these were, what we'd call strays. We'd call, these fish came from all kinds of different places. And a recent study just published by the team at UC Davis found that those strays, these fish that came from all over, have been returning each year. And now we've created a new novel run of salmon, that never existed before. It has no genetics to that area. It's these strays, these hatchery fish, and now they're cued into that area and coming back year after year. And yeah, so it really shows, again, this resilience in our wildlife that's adapted to this wide swing of environmental changes in California and the Central Valley, long years of drought, lots of flooding. They're able to take advantage of a whole suite of different things, and we can start to show that. And
so this is, you've done a renovation on Poudre Creek. Is that also combined with the fish that are going down the Sacramento River?
yes.
And what you've been doing there to
They all come into the Sacramento River. And then, so yeah, the next step is, delivering food to these fish, if you will.
Okay.
And we're expanding that all over the reaches now. It took a while for a lot of the fisheries biologists to get on board with this idea, that we can manage this, that we can produce this and provide it. So we're getting more and more of that going.
And it's a novel run because they're hatchery raised. So there's no underlying Poudre Creek.
Right. There was historically, but that run went extinct with the dam. And then, for, basically 40 years, there was no salmon in the creek.
Yeah.
Right. So there's no, a lot of times you see, there's a small percentage of wild fish that return to an area and they try to build up that. But this didn't have any wild fish left. Yeah. And so it really created its own run. It saw this happen. I'll say that the fish were able to respond to new habitat that was made available.
But they're still not in Lake Berryessa.
No. But, with that in mind, I don't know if you've seen State Fish and Wildlife in combination with Department of Water Resources has been trying a new approach in some of our reservoirs. Lake Shasta is one of them, and they did it on the Yuba River recently in McLeod, where they're taking fish from the river, took them around the dam and putting them up in the spawning habitat. And then when those fish spawn and the babies come out, they're going to have to catch them and bring them around and put them on the other side of the dam. So really labor intensive, but there's hundreds of miles of spawning habitat that's good in those areas in the mountains. and fish can't get to them anymore. So we'll see how that pans out.
Fish ladders, that is just too tall to.
Well, in this case, say something like Shasta Dam, they just can't get around that, you know. And actually, you know, as a biologist and a scientist, it's not all that bad because, you know, let's take something like the McCloud River. You know, the young of the year come out, you put a big trap there, a couple what they call screw traps, which are big barrel traps. You catch all those fish every year and bring them back. That becomes your long-term monitoring program. So you're catching everything in there. You can sample the aquatic insects in there as well, and you can see how that system is changing, and you can then, you know, manage it better that way too. So done the right way, it can be a part of an adaptive management approach. But yeah, we'll see where these salmon go. It's a fascinating time. So again, you know, this idea that we're creating these new habitats, these what I'm calling novel ecosystems. They're not the same habitats that our fish and wildlife evolved with, but we're able to provide through management, through habitat creation, you know, really, if you will, the biophysical conditions that these animals need to survive. And, you know, we can do that through manipulation of things and by creating. So very different than, you know, I'll say that romantic notion of these wild areas. And, you know, these two examples show that we can do that for something like, you know, waterfowl, where we've lost 95% of the wetlands in the state through actively management and building habitat. We can have basically as many waterfowl as we've ever had in the Central Valley. And we know what it would take for fish as well. You know, the politics behind fish and waterfowl are very different. So it's much more challenging, but we know, you know, and we know that for, you know, a lot of species.
So, and as you reintroduce salmon up into the tributaries that lead into the Shasta Dam, Shasta Lake, that will impact eagles and osprey and.
Yeah, that's going to be the fascinating thing, is to see how that system changes. Yeah, because even, you know, as they're catching these young migrating out, they're not going to get all of them. You know, so they're going to get established in other areas, and we're going to see. Yeah, we'll see the birds respond, and you know, some would argue, you know, the whole system respond, where, you know, when salmon spawn, they die, their carcasses rot. It provides a lot of nutrients to the environment that the insects need, the plants need. The whole system comes back. So no, we'll see where it all goes. Yeah. And so now we'll put that in the light of climate change. And I grabbed some recent books to get an example here. You know, what are we doing here? The end of the world. You know, the climate of corruption, the global warming hoax. You know, false alarm. You know, just so dramatic and so extreme, and, you know, the end of the world and lies and what has that done? This is a study that was done just 2 years ago, looking at basically elementary school through high school kids and surveying them on how they felt about climate change.
It didn't show.
Oh, it's on my side.
Interesting.
The end of the world.
It looks like Dan's on this.
The end of the world out loud.
Huh. Let me see if I can share it again.
Is Marty trying to ask a question?
There you go.
There it goes. Huh.
I must have timed out or something weird.
Yeah. Right. I've been hitting the screen. You wouldn't think of it. But we got it. So yeah, this is a study that was done in 2023, looking at our school age children and asking them about climate change and what they feel and those emotions around it. And you can see, I mean, sadness, anxiety. I mean, some of these are pretty dramatic, where, you know, 4 out of 10 people are considering not having children because of climate change. You know, what are we teaching these kids? What are we showing them? You know, we just talked about, you know, the dynamic nature of the environment and how it's changing all the time. You know, what what are we doing here? And again, things are changing. Climate change is real. It's happening. Things are going to be different than they once were. And there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers, but the Earth's not going to just blow up and be gone, And, really what it does, the flip side of that, some of the stuff I just showed you, we can impact what happens and we can in some ways choose what we want things to look like. We can use this as an opportunity to say, what habitats do we want out there? How are we going to mitigate them? Where are we going to create them? We're going to, there's a lot we can do and start planning for. But I want to give you some examples. Here's one of the winners of climate change, if you will. Our Arctic nesting geese, our Ross's geese and lesser snow geese. If you look at the mid-continent population, that middle graph, you can see how steeply that's climbed. And California is the same way. Our population has grown dramatically. And this map on our right, birds to the west there in the mid part of the continent, even in Arkansas, places like that. 40 years ago, they didn't have snow geese. These birds have moved throughout the continent to places they've never been before. We were working with the biologist in Idaho, one of their wildlife areas. 20 years ago, if they got a snow goose out there, birders went out there, it was on the list, everybody went to go see it. 2 years ago, they had 45,000. So these populations, they're the winners of climate change. They nest in the far Arctic. It's slowly warmed ever so slightly. It's created a whole bunch more forage for the birds, for their young. It's changed the predator communities. A lot of these birds nest in colonies. Talking to biologists up there, it wasn't uncommon for a polar bear to wander through a colony and just stomp 10 or 15 nests. Those polar bears aren't there anymore. So their nest success is higher, there's more food available, and there's more nesting habitat. As a result, their populations are expanding dramatically. So they're a winner. Another potential winner, if you will, these changing hydrological patterns, these changing rainfall patterns, changing rainfall locations, potentially is changing where habitat is available. Habitats we predict will migrate, will shift where they can, they'll dry out in some areas, they'll show up in others, occur in whole new locations. One of the things we see happening already, and it's predicted to go even further, is salmon up in Alaska. As glaciers are melting, those things are changing. Right now, salmon populations like in the Kenai Peninsula, which is their historic hotspot, are proposed to be listed as endangered. Their numbers are going down, but to the north, we're finding more and more spawning habitat made available as glaciers melt, as new habitat comes available. And they predict, a paper just a couple of years ago predicted that in the coming years, there'd be 3,800 more miles of spawning habitat available as a result of that. And so populations will shift north. So again, it'll be different. The fish won't be gone. They won't be using the same areas, but these new habitats will be created. So getting back to that dynamic nature of things versus, the world's coming to an end. Everything's gone and it's, we're all going to die. And
so things that can move.
Well, right.
Like our trees.
Well, we're seeing tree migration patterns too. And what we have to do is allow that to happen. So we're seeing like our redwoods, like in Santa Cruz Mountains, are moving with the rainfall, and we need to allow those things to happen. And we can. We know how to create those habitats, so we know how to do that. It just has to be a choice. And one of my favorites recently that kind of illustrates where we are, I think is a precursor to climate change and what's to come, is the debate right now between spotted owls and barred owls. So barred owls came from the east and have migrated west. And there's good evidence that they were migrating west, but human intervention, human clearing of the landscape, and then planting tree rows, artificially changing habitats allowed them to move quicker. And now they're well established in the Sierra Nevada mountains. They're in the Pacific Northwest and into parts of Northern California, in those forests. And barred owls have a much more diverse diet. So they're eating a lot more things, they have more food available, and they're out, they will clearly outcompete spotted owls. I think it's the evidence, there are 3 or 4 papers published in the last few years showing very clearly that they will outcompete spotted owls and take their habitat. But they're also going to eat a whole suite of the salamanders, flying squirrels, a whole bunch of things in that old growth forest. So the whole community is going to change. And so how did U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service respond? Well, they're proposing to shoot over 400,000 owls. Well, was that the solution? I don't know. I think if you say, for me as a scientist, if you say, hey, we need more time to figure this out. If we go in there and kill some owls, it'll buy us 4 or 5 years to figure it out. Okay. But as a long-term solution, in the face of climate change and population shifting and habitat shifting, we're going to see more and more of this kind of stuff. And we have that opportunity to pick and choose what lives and what kind of environment we want. Do we want spotted owls and barred owls and say, hey, best bird win, go at it? Or do we want to actively, remove them and try to create habitats and keep them separate? And we're going to have more and more of that with climate change. And unprecedented in how we deal with these types of issues, but also an exciting opportunity to say.
Aren't they mating now? I thought I heard of.
I haven't seen that yet.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's any reason to believe that they wouldn't. Just given their size and their structure and their similarities. But yeah, the barred owls. I don't know if you saw. We had one in Midtown Sacramento last week.
Really?
Yeah.
Capitals?
Darn near. Yeah, it was on 16th and I want to say 16th and H, something like that. But landed in a tree. Landed in a tree there. Stayed for 2 days. Everybody took pictures of it, and then it disappeared. So, barred owl. Yep. Yeah. So no, fascinating. I'll say ethical discussion of what we do and how we handle these things and what role we play.
Yeah, big controversy there.
Yep. And that gets me to this idea. Where are we going, and what do we choose to keep, and what type of world do we want to live in? And it makes me think. I'll give you an example from my life. After my first year of college, this would have been late 80s. I was reading a bunch of John Muir. I needed to go see wilderness. I needed to get out in the forest. I needed to, I was convinced that's what I needed in life. And so school ended, and a buddy of mine lived in Oregon, and I got my backpack together, my tent, my fishing pole, and some water purifiers. And he dropped me off at Castle Crag State Park on his way up to Oregon. And I hiked west and north through all those mountains, spent a month out there, and called him when I was ready to go back. And I was out there for about almost 3 weeks, and I was up in the Marble Mountains Wilderness area. And this was, before cell phones, before, I had a paper map. And so, I just went where I wanted to go, and I lived off of fish. And a buddy of mine had told me he had done something similar that, when you get really hungry, look on your map and find a place where you'll find weekend campers and go down. And he said, specifically, look for a mom with kids and, go introduce yourself if they're nice and let them know you've been out there for 2 or 3 weeks. They always bring too much food and they'll just start giving you stuff. And he was right. A bag of chips never tasted so good. A Coke never tasted so good. And so I've been out there, I say 2.5, 3 weeks and in Marble Mountains, and I wanted to fish one of these lakes. So I got out there, and I'm getting in the evening time ready to fish, and I hear this vehicle. I'm like, what in the world? And yeah, this guy in a Jeep's 4-wheeling, he's going all through there, and he drives up onto the lake. I mean, this is a wilderness area, And he gets on the other side of the lake, and I watch him. He pulls out all his stuff. He's getting all kinds of stuff out, setting up camp. I got to go see this, So I walk over there. He sees my fishing rod. We start talking fishing. I walk around his camp. He's got tables like this set out there in black. He had 2 tables, and they were completely lined with guns. One was all kinds of different handguns. The other one was long guns and automatic weapons. And I'm like, and he sees me look at it. He comes over with me and goes, "You always got to be ready. You never know when they're going to come. They're out there, and I'm ready for them." I'm like, holy cow, you know? And I get back, you know, I turned it left, went fishing, and it hit me that, you know, I was in one of the most peaceful times of my life. You know, I hadn't seen a person for a week. I was fishing. I was watching bears fishing in the creek. I was, you know, enjoying the birds in the trees. And this guy had brought all his anger, all his fear, all his hatred from the city to this special place, and, you know, couldn't enjoy it because of that. And I realized that at that point that wilderness, if you will, is a state of mind. It's how we see things. And, you know, now I think of something for myself, something like this white-crowned sparrow. You know, the sparrows show up in my yard every year about second, third week of September, and they leave about the last week of April. And that first sparrow shows up, and I think of this. I think of, you know, that bird might have traveled over 2,000 miles to get to my backyard after nesting in the Arctic, nesting in Alaska. And, you know, some of the research has been done, they might fly up to 300 miles in one day. You know, and this is a 6-inch bird with a 9-inch wingspan, and it just traveled from Alaska to my backyard. You know, that's wilderness. That's something special. You know, I can see that now, that it's a state